Okay, this is going to be about Nazi superweapons and just Nazi technology in general, because most people have no idea just how advanced Nazi technology was. And, they had some pretty crazy guys in their tech development. But the thing is, when you've got crazy people with almost unlimited funds and labor, you can achieve some incredible things. Now, the Nazis were about 100 years ahead of everybody else in terms of their edge of technology. They were the first to explode an atomic bomb, which happened in 1944. It was witnessed also by Italian military that was invited to witness it. It knocked out all the power lines in Berlin because they didn't know about the EMP effects of atom bombs. But they also had what they call a molecular bomb, which basically kind of has the same explosive power as an atom bomb, but without the radioactivity. And of course they had lasers, well ahead of the Americans. Now, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for laser research technology was, I think, in 1964, something like that. But the Nazis had been developing laser technology many years before that. And in fact, I believe they had developed it to use it in cyclotronic uranium enrichment facilities, which was probably in Auschwitz. Auschwitz was supposed to be a rubber plant, a Buna rubber plant manufacturing thing. It never produced 1 kilo of rubber, and it used up more electricity than the whole of Berlin did every day. Furthermore, when after the Second World War, a lot of the officers and so on were placed by the English in this German in this compound, essentially, but in a house that was wired for sound, and they just let them mingle with each other, and eventually a few things sort of transpired. Although the Germans were, assumed they were being monitored, so they were pretty careful about what they said. But even then, they did talk about the fact that they were using laser technology to enrich uranium. And in fact, it appears as if Enola Gay and Little Boy, the two bombs that were dropped on Japan, were actually finished with enriched uranium from the Nazis. It looks like America cut some kind of a deal, allowed some of the submarines through, and one submarine in particular, I forget the number, that got stopped by the Swedish forces, by the British forces, and basically the Americans said waved it through. And this particular submarine delivered, I think it was 88 gold-lined containers of something. And the only reason you'd have a gold-lined container would be to contain the radioactive material that's used to create the atom bomb. And also, if you look at the Manhattan Project and how much enriched uranium they had developed by that point in the war, by August or so, they didn't really have enough to create one bomb, never mind two. So it looks as if part of the deal, was that. But now, the really interesting thing is, I wanted to show you a book that is sort of, this guy's, I would say, the foremost research for that sort of stuff. I've shown this book before. I never had a chance to read this in complete detail, just because it is, unfortunately, again, it's a little bit better laid out than the Joseph Farrell books, but not ideal in terms of presentation, but a lot better than Joseph Farrell books. But the information is really great, and he's got a lot of, I just want to quickly zap through. He's got a lot of Freedom of Information Act documents. He's got a lot of diagrams, a lot of photographs as well of some of the bases and so on. So very well researched, very well backed up by evidence. He's also got some newspaper clippings which are not particularly big deal, but there are a lot of corroborating restricted and top secret and Freedom of Information Act documents relating to these secret documents and so on, relating to these technologies. But the really interesting thing on this is about Hans Kammler. Now, Hans Kammler was the guy who was in charge of the secret bases where all these super weapons got produced. And they, Germans being Germans, not very imaginative in certain ways, they had called these things S1, S2, S3. S3 being the one probably with a bell, which was another super weapon technology that was being researched. Now, the bell apparently was related to things like the Philadelphia experiment, where it put objects out of phase, and some of because they used human people, they used humans as guinea pigs to see what would happen, and some of them just rotted away. Some of them apparently got half embedded into materials. And so this technology was apparently both interdimensional as well as spatially, it had some effects that would rapidly age things, put them out of phase so that they would like sort of pass through walls, and then when they came back, people were half embedded in concrete and stuff. Now, how much of this is true, how much is myth, is very difficult to prove, but there was definitely something there. And the thing about Hans Kammler is that he had absolutely no compunction to use, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of slave labor to death, and work them to death without any, conscience about it. And he did this in several places. And just before the Allied forces took over these areas where some of these bases were, all the scientists involved were killed. They were killed. Hans Kammler was in charge of that, and they were sort of destroyed. Now, Hans Kammler died 4 times. There are at least 4 different reports of how he supposedly committed suicide, was killed, was bombed, whatever. Now, the really interesting about this is that there is some evidence in here which I'd never come across that describes what happened to Hans Kammler. And now I knew that Hans Kammler did not die. I knew that he survived the war. And in my fiction books, he is going to be quite a central figure, although it's not really talked about until the 3rd book, which I'm busy writing very slowly, because I knew that he hadn't died. Apparently, what happened to Hans Kammler, he only died in 1972, and there's people discussed in this book that spoke with him, had access to him, and apparently he was set up in Prague. And Kammler spoke fluent Czech as well as German, and he was accessed by both the Allied forces and the Soviets. So he was kind of like a mini version of the Cold War front. The Soviets and the Americans essentially divided amongst themselves the Nazi scientists. Project Paperclip imported over 3,000 Nazi scientists, including Werner von Braun, to the United States and set them up there. And these guys were in full control of the space program of the Americans, to the point where they would shoot up rockets with film cameras that would film things inside the rocket, and by the time they went to pick the rocket up, the cameras had already been removed and the film had already been removed by Nazi agents that were based in Argentina, but that crossed the border whenever they wanted. And the Americans were like, oh, what's going on here? Now, the thing that you probably don't know is, and I describe some of this technology in the fiction books, like one feature of my Overlords of Mars series is that it's got some sections in italics, and those sections are purely historical, no fiction at all. I mean, they had some really weird weapons that nobody still really knows how they work now. One of them was these little flying discs that would float up and attach themselves to the wings of Allied planes and then blow up, setting on fire the fuel inside the wings and so on, which is really an odd weapon. Like, how do you even get that to work, The Foo Fighters, which is the name of a rock band, were actually Nazi weapons, these like glowing balls that look like little mini UFOs. And there comes the story: were they alien craft, were they alien observer craft, or were they Nazi weapons that like made all your electromagnetic stuff go haywire and so on? But they were also the first. The Nazis were also the first to include the digitizing of information, so digital data on magnetic tape, essentially the first computers and so on, which the Americans were pretty slow on the uptake on that. Now, if I had to give you my best guess, I'm convinced, I'm absolutely certain that the Germans had, secret bases all over the world. I mean, this is not just my opinion. This is a fact. I mean, there's secret Nazi under submarine bases in Gran Canaria, which I've visited. I haven't visited the secret base, but it's known that they're there. There are secret bases throughout South America. There have been a few documentaries done about these houses with Nazi insignia in the middle of the jungle, like sort of in the middle of nowhere, really hard to get to. And there's a full house there built with like Nazi insignias and so on. So there's no doubt that the Nazis had built, and they had done this since the 1920s. So they knew what they were doing, and they started to produce and create these Nazi secret bases all over the world, in very inaccessible places, a lot of them for submarines. And, the submarines kept getting developed more and more and more, to the point where the engineering inside the submarines was, again, way ahead of anything that was available at the time. Most people are not aware that the American stealth fighter bomber technology is actually originating from Nazi submarines that could defeat radar. So when radar came out, the Nazis quickly developed a way to have their submarines be sort of invisible to radar, and that technology is essentially what's being used by the stealth bombers today. Their engines of the submarines also got adapted, and again, this is not just opinion or myth. This is factual. In fact, I want to show you a little document that at one point I had sued a company that was doing some really dodgy shit, Billfinger Burger, and they tried to make me responsible for some of their dodgy crap. I wouldn't have it, so I sued them and I won. And for a while I had some money that I could invest to do whatever. And I was going to do a 1-year master's course in electromechanical engineering, and I'd found a professor that was willing to let me do the thesis that I wanted to do, which was based on this. I don't know if you can read that, but this is a document that I got a copy of from the British Library, which is now a report from British intelligence, which is now sort of being declassified. But in here, I wanted to see if I think there's a diagram, if I remember right. This was discussing some of the magnetic apparatus, and there's two versions of them, one a little bit more complicated than the other, of what some people refer to as over-unity devices. That is machinery that seems to produce energy out of thin air, that was used in the Nazi submarines to achieve a certain there we go. So this is the one that I was going to try and repeat. So these are magnets that have coils around them, and they're set in a sort of type of configuration that seems to produce electricity out of nowhere, and well beyond anything that seems to be, there's some diagrams of how it was done. And this is a document, this is a report, British report done by some British intelligence officers that were trying to understand how this technology worked, and they had captured some of the technology and some of the personnel that knew something about it, but not the full story. There was also some really interesting data on German and Japanese industry, which was published in 1948. It's interesting from an economical and manufacturing point of view, because it sort of somewhat puts the lie to some of the historical context of what Germany and Japan could and were able to do and were not able to do, and so on. Anyway, I found this professor who was willing to let me do my master's thesis in electromagnetic theory based on this, trying to reproduce this technology. There was two two of these electromagnetic devices that were powering submarines in the document. One of them was a bit more involved and would have been a lot more expensive to try and reproduce. The one I showed you, the hexagonal shape one, is the easier one to reproduce potentially, and that was the idea, to try and reproduce it and see how it worked. Unfortunately, I completely snapped my right Achilles tendon, completely snapped, and then that put that to bed, because I was on crutches for 6 months. I couldn't really do much, and after that I had to start working again. So the money that I had set aside for that just wasn't available anymore, and so I didn't get to do it. But that's just one of the tiny developments of the many technological advancements that they had made on their submarines. And the essential concept is that as the image that I'm using for this video, the still, that's what they call the Hanubo devices, which are Nazi-based UFOs, essentially. Now, keep in mind, they had lasers that worked. I am absolutely convinced that they had these anti-gravity devices. I know the bell was a real thing, and it produced also these anti-gravity sort of effects. There are two different types of technology related to the anti-gravity devices, and they first appeared in South America around 1947, same time as Roswell and so on, where the Nazis had plenty of these bases. And what they did is they actually got mostly American manufacturing firms to produce the component parts. They were then shipped through many of the German-funded South American companies. You got to keep in mind that Martin Bormann exported so much money, and with Otto Skorzeny, which was the commando guy of the Germans, and I've read up a little bit more about Otto Skorzeny, and apparently, I just assumed that a lot of the Otto Skorzeny stuff was a lot of myth and bluster and a lot of bullshit. But actually, it seems like he really was a very effective commando, a really, sort of special ops of the special ops types. And he was also tasked with setting up security and the Odessa stuff, all the sort of secret after the war Nazi bases he had something to do with. And so these various aerospace company, engineering companies who were building these parts, all compartmentalized, so they didn't know what they were building. They were told, it was some piece of machinery or whatever, and they don't care, they just build it. And that's how things get built today as well, by the way. Like, no aerospace company has got all the stuff to build a complete rocket or a complete new type of aircraft. They get parts and they don't really know what it is, and then it gets assembled by the Nazis on the Nazi bases in South America, apparently in South Africa. And that's very interesting to me, because there is a location in South Africa which I'm very familiar with, which I was told is where one of these bases were. And it somewhat made sense to me, because I've recently, been out there, last year sometime, I think. But and I saw that, I went past that place again, and it's quite changed. They've made it quite a bit more covered up. But it used to be a road that I used to drive past relatively often whenever I went to South Africa. And there was just this giant sort of military base that was essentially empty. It was like a huge fenced off field with warnings not to get in there, but it was just flat ground. And I got interviewed by a guy after I wrote The Face on Mars. I got interviewed by a guy in South Africa that spoke to me for his radio channel or whatever, and then spoke to me off the record and said that he had been contacted by people that knew that what I'd written about was true and had further information. And he told me that he spoke to one of the guys that had worked, an electrician that had worked on one of these machines, and before he could work on them, he had to sign off all these sort of non-disclosure agreements that were like, Official Secrets Act, we're going to wipe you and your whole family out if you ever tell anybody. And he told him that he'd done this sort of in around those periods in the 50s, and he was now 90 something years of age, dying of lung cancer, and didn't have any surviving relatives. And so he told this radio guy the whole story. And the radio guy, I'm not, I think he mentioned it, but he didn't do a full show on it, because he said to me privately, he said, well, partly I was a bit scared, and partly I didn't have any other sort of evidence to back it up, although this guy had shown me documents that, pretty much proved what he was telling me in terms of the non-disclosure agreements and so on. But I just didn't want to go near it. I got scared. And he sort of told me that in confidence, there was no reason for him to tell me that or lie to me about it. He wasn't trying to get me to do anything or, give him money, or, there was really no reason other than, he's just a guy that came across that information, and he found somebody else that knew about the stuff, and he thought, well, I'm just going to tell you about it. There definitely were secret bases. Another very interesting book, or two books rather, written by this guy, who's unfortunately dead, because I tried to get in touch with him and he died just shortly before I managed to get a hold of him. Colonel Howard A. Buckner. Very interesting man, and definitely somebody who had a pretty serious sense of things. Not a liar, but he wrote this in conjunction with somebody that, it's a nom de plume, Captain Willem Barnhart. Captain Willem Barnhart was apparently one of the guys in one of the two submarines that appeared in Mar del Plata in Argentina months after the war ended, with a whole German contingent in it. And we're like, well, where have you guys been for the last 5 months? In the second book, Hitler's Ashes, basically what they're saying here is that there was a base in Antarctica, and that Hitler's ashes, because Hitler died in Argentina, not in a bunker in Germany, and his ashes were deposited in this Antarctic base apparently, so they wouldn't be disturbed by the Allies. Now, if you ask me what my opinion is, I'm absolutely certain that Project Highjump had something to do with rooting out whatever Nazis were left in Antarctica, because Project Highjump made no sense other than, it was a military operation with something like 25 craft, tracked combat vehicles, 4,000 soldiers in Antarctica at the close of the war, when, for what? Supposedly a survey of the continent. It was supposed to last 8 months. They came back after 4 or 5 weeks with their tail between their legs, having lost men, machinery, still classified how many men died on that trip. And Admiral Byrd, who was the foremost polar explorer at the time, and clearly not an insane man. I've seen videos of Admiral Byrd talking. He's a very serious guy, a very professional guy. His diaries are still under lock and key, top secret, and they sort of said he went crazy and he died in an asylum, sort of thing. They wouldn't let him tell the truth. But on the trip back, before he got sort of gagged, he mentioned to a journalist of El Mercurio, which was a newspaper that was on board, that America and the rest of the world would have to be careful and prepare for craft that could do things that none of the existing aircraft that they had at the time could do, of polar origin. In other words, what I think happened is there was a Nazi base. The Nazis had built at least a few of these UFO prototypes. Some of them produced like smoke. Some of them weren't like the clean sort of anti-gravity machines of science fiction. Some of them were pretty rough things. And some of these smoke-producing UFOs, there are stories of that all over South America, Brazil in particular. And Brazil is a huge country with like thousands and thousands and thousands of square kilometers of jungle that no one has ever been to. But of course, in Argentina, the Nazis had, what is that place? Bariloche. I forget the full name, a city. There are literal mini cities in Argentina that are full-on German-speaking, German school-only Nazi enclaves. I mean, there were small country-sized estates that were private, and you could only get into if you had SSID. There's a guy called Peter Levanda who's kind of a geek, and he writes sort of really weird, sort of interesting books about all sorts of supernatural stuff, but also Nazi technology. And I wouldn't put him in the New Age woo-woo camp. He is definitely onto something. he's kind of a nerdy guy, but one of those nerds that's sort of fearless out of inconscience rather than bravery necessarily. And he basically got all the way to South America, figured out where this place in Argentina, got a taxi to it. He basically took a taxi to like a Nazi enclave in Argentina, went up to the gate, and they were like, guys in machine guns, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And he's like, before they sort of realized who he was, he's sort of like, oh, okay, gotta go now. And he got back in the taxi and he got away before they like disappeared him, So very interesting guy, but my best guess would be that the Nazis did have some of these. They did make some of these flying machines. It was right at the end of the war, so they couldn't really use them for the actual war effort. But they successfully used them against Project Highjump, kicked the Americans' ass, flew them pretty much almost over the White House. That's where the term flying saucer come from. A guy called Kenneth Arnold, who was a pilot, a private pilot, I believe, and he saw these flying saucers. That's how he described them. Shortly after the war, essentially, pretty close to the White House. So what were the Germans doing? Well, they kicked the Americans' ass in South America. They made a deal with them to give them enough enriched uranium to bomb Japan just at the close of the war. They had, is it Carlos de Bariloche? They had these enclaves in Argentina where they held practically all cities where they carried on this technology and this research, as well as other bases in South America and I believe in Antarctica. And kind of flew a bunch of these discs close enough to the White House to let them know just fuck all you can do about it. You might have a lot more military and airplanes and whatever, but we can literally kill you in your sleep, in your home. You, the President of the United States, so leave us the fuck alone and we'll do what we want. And then they also helped America develop the NASA space program, faked all the moon landings, although I do believe they did go to the moon, but not the way they say they went. I do believe that anti-gravity technology did allow the Americans to land on the moon, but not, with the rocket technology that they say they went. And most of all the things that you've seen about the Apollo landings are completely studio created things. And they held their own off. I mean, there was like, I can't remember if it's something like 3,000 or 4,000 companies started with Nazi money from Argentina. The IG Farben, IBM, huge companies that are still around today, were originally funded, seeded with Nazi money. And essentially, the Nazis were the third force. Werner von Braun plotted out, and there's a lady that worked with him, whose name I always forget. I think it's Elizabeth something, Clara maybe, can't remember. Anyway, she worked with him, and he admitted to her what was going to happen. It was going to be like, oh, the Cold War thing will continue. For now, it's Russia against America. Then it's going to be nations of concern, like terrorist nations, the Arab world. Then it's going to be meteorites are going to be the next thing. And all of this is just to push the technology so that it gets developed without the people on the planet really knowing what's going on, because anti-gravity technology is extremely dangerous. Which leads me back to, I came about this in a completely different way. I discovered sort of the anti-gravity technology by looking at what happened on Mars. But anti-gravity technology can destroy a planet in, a matter of hours. So keeping it all secret, but at the same time developing it. And, Werner von Braun was on record basically saying, and the last thing we're going to pretend that's happening is alien invasion. Can you believe it? Ha ha ha, alien invasion. So most of the UFOs that, people have seen and so on are just Nazi UFOs. But there is also a very interesting aspect to it, which is that apparently, originally, some of the research relating to Hanebucraft and anti-gravity machines came through mediums, German mediums, spiritualist mediums that contacted supposed aliens or, people from beyond the grave or who knows, that gave them some of this information. Now, it sounds crazy, except that, who was one of these mediums that apparently also had a hand in some of the military decisions that were taken was the wife of von Clausewitz, the guy who wrote On War, who was the foremost sort of proponent of the blitzkrieg type of war strategy. So yeah, Nazi super weapons definitely existed. The Nazis were way ahead of anything even remotely at that time. There's probably a bunch of stuff that we think was developed by whichever company or person, whatever, that was developed by the Nazis first, and it's just been the narrative has had to come up with something else, because it wouldn't look good to say that the Nazis developed all sorts of technology that we're using today. Would make people start questioning a few other things, so that's it. I mean, my best guess is, yeah, they did have anti-gravity machines. They did have an Antarctic base, at least one, maybe more. I do believe that essentially the development of the submarines morphed into the anti-gravity craft. Now, do I really believe that the Nazis went to the moon and Mars? In a way, yes, because I do believe that we did go to the moon, and we did not go there with American-built technology. We went there with Nazi-built technology. And who knows what else we've done with Nazi-built technology. Once you've perfected these anti-gravity machines, there's no reason why we wouldn't have bases on the moon already. It's a very interesting book by a guy called Leonard, Said Somebody Else Is on the Moon, that was written in the 50s, which has photographs and people observing machinery on the moon, moving stuff around, huge machines. Do I think it's possible that the Nazis had some bases on the moon? Yeah, I think it's possible. I don't think it's necessarily very likely, but I think it's definitely possible. And I also believe that the 3 atom bombs that were exploded in Antarctica in the mid-50s, 54 if I remember right, had nothing to do with, again, the supposed reason they were researching about the ozone layer, like, so you blow atom bombs up? No. I do think that was connected to the Nazi bases in Antarctica in some way. I don't know whether it was a continuing Cold War that became hot, if it was a destruction of the bases so that there was no evidence left, if it was a show of force by the Americans. Who knows? I don't know. But let's just put it this way. My science fiction books, the Overlords of Mars series, there's a lot more science in there than fiction, and there's a lot more things that are actually potentially real or actually real than most people would think. There you go. That's my video for today. Enjoy if you can sleep at night now, knowing that the Nazis were way ahead of everybody else with all sorts of technology. Yeah, kind of weird, but when you start to look into history, real history, and what really happened, it sort of goes like that. It becomes a bit of a rabbit hole. Anyway, good night.